Welcome back. This is episode 23 of John or Lazarus, who wrote the fourth gospel. This is entitled Scholarly Research. So what we're going to kind of do today is just take a little side note and look at what others have said in the past about authorship. These are guys who write commentaries, scholars. So I did happen to come across a book that I was very pleased and surprised to see that this guy put a lot of weight on the possibility that Lazarus wrote it. Most commentaries, they'll mention the fact that Lazarus is one of the potential authors that people have for the fourth gospel, but they usually, at the end of it, their conclusion is, we're just going to stick with the tradition that John wrote it, because they're just not putting enough weight on the internal evidence here. But again, it's nice to know that there are some people out there who have written papers and commentaries that do recognize Lazarus. So the purpose of today's video, as we said, we're going to show that there are some biblical scholars who recognize Lazarus as a potential author of the fourth gospel. So I've got a couple of charts here. My source is the Gospel and Letters of John, a commentary by R. Alan Culpepper. Again, I was reading this just because I've been just immersing myself in the fourth gospel. It's just been awesome. And I was just really surprised to come across this chart that this guy provided. So I just want to share that with you, especially if you've been on this journey and you share the same conclusion about authorship. So here it is. He has arguments against identifying the beloved disciple with John. His first point, he says that in Mark, John was among the group of 3 disciples who were present at the Transfiguration, the raising of Jairus' daughter, and at the Garden of Gethsemane. In John, however, the inner 3 are not singled out as a group, and there is no record of these 3 momentous experiences. Jesus goes to a garden across from the Kidron, but it is not named Gethsemane. Jesus does not take the 3 apart from the others, and there is no agony there. So his point there in number 1 was that you've got these, what he calls momentous occasions. It's very strange that John wouldn't write about them if John was the author of this gospel. Point number 2, we have James, the brother of John. He is never mentioned except in chapter 21, verse 2, and that's not even by name. So his point there, strange that John would write a gospel and never mention his brother James. Point number 3, that beloved disciple hardly seems to have the character of a son of thunder. We've talked about this on our videos, especially at the Last Supper when the beloved disciple is leaning on Jesus's bosom. That is not something that John, one of the sons of thunder, would be doing. Point number 4, John is a Galilean, but most of the Gospel of John deals with Jesus's ministry in Judea. Agreed with that 100%. Point number 5, the beloved disciple is at the cross in John, but the synoptics say that the disciples all fled, and there is no record of any of the disciples being at the cross. Again, another huge point right there. And point number 6, it's unlikely that a Galilean fisherman would have been known to the household of the high priest in Jerusalem. That's a key one there too. And his final point, number 7, he says, there are no exorcisms in John, but the only scene in which the Apostle John appears alone in the synoptics involves the unauthorized exorcist in Mark chapter 9. Moreover, in Luke 9, John and his brothers want to call down fire on a Samaritan village, but the Gospel of John takes a positive attitude towards the Samaritans. That was an interesting point I hadn't thought of. So after he gives that chart, he says, not all these arguments are of equal weight, but taken together, they pose formidable internal difficulties for the view that the beloved disciple was John, the son of Zebedee. I agree 100% again. And then here's his transition. He says, on the other hand, an interesting case can be made for internal grounds for identifying the beloved disciple as Lazarus. And here's his chart here. Arguments in favor of Lazarus being the beloved disciple. Number 1, Jesus is said to have loved Lazarus. That's a pretty simple, straightforward one. Point number 2, Lazarus does not appear until John 11, just before the beloved disciple is introduced in John 13. So interesting timing there. Point number 3, the raising of Lazarus is the greatest of the 7 signs in the gospel. So that's another interesting point that, most people point out there are 7 miracles or signs done in the fourth gospel. And if the most important one was the raising of Lazarus, is it not possible that Lazarus had written the gospel too? Point number 4, I think, is his transition to point number 5. He says Lazarus was a Judean from Bethany. That could tie into the fact that most of the gospel was written from the point of view in Judea, in Jerusalem. But it also points to point number 5, which is that Lazarus might have been known to the high priest. In our videos, we looked at that too, saying, Lazarus likely worked at the temple. And that, again, explains his tying into everything going on in the priests and the temple. And point number 6, the references to the grave clothes in John chapter 20 take on an interesting significance if the disciple who witnessed them had himself been bound in such wrappings. And this ties up to our last video in Mark, when we had that naked young man who was in linen cloths, and we showed that those linen cloths, those were used for burial. So this is a similar point here in John chapter 20, when Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, who we believe is Lazarus, it makes more sense, when Lazarus looks in there and he sees the linen cloths, it says that's when he believed. So a very significant moment for Lazarus to see those grave clothes. It would have no significance for John. And point number 7, the belief that he would not die, meaning the beloved disciple, might easily have arisen if the beloved disciple had already been raised from the dead. This is in reference to Peter asking Jesus about the beloved disciple at the end of the 4th gospel, and about the rumor about him not dying. That only makes sense if he's talking about Lazarus, because Jesus had raised him from the dead. It actually doesn't make sense with John. It's also almost contradictory, because in the synoptic gospels, John and James were told by Jesus that they were going to suffer martyrdom. So it would be no point for for Peter to ask that question of John. And he closes here, the author, and says again, not all of the arguments are forceful, and even taken together, they fail to overcome the fact that the gospel stops short of identifying the beloved disciple with Jesus. I do agree it stops short of saying that, but even the evidence that the author here has presented, it seems like he's not adverse to taking that position. And then this book, it goes into external evidence. He does a real good job. I don't want to take too much time here. He talks about Papias and Irenaeus, but he does make a point to say all of this so-called external evidence from the church fathers, most of it is second or third hand statements that people were making about their previous teachers. He uses a lot of terms saying the statements are puzzling or they're confusing. Another note here, the first attribution of the gospel to the apostle John seems to have come from the Gnostics. That's interesting. Again, he talks about Irenaeus and Polycarp. Here's a funny statement. He says, the chain of testimony seems to be convincing about John, but questions remain concerning Irenaeus' credibility. So it seems like he's kind of mocking the credibility there, just from the whole theory about John. It says, Papias himself, as we have seen, made no claims to having heard the apostle. His information was secondhand at best. So the external evidence, it's secondhand, it's confusing, it's puzzling. And then he gets an authorship of John in modern scholarship, and he mentioned some guys that make the same points that were already made, that it's almost impossible for John to have been the author. And our author's conclusion here is that he says the gospel itself contains claims that it was written by an eyewitness, the beloved disciple. That's all it flat out says. His final conclusion is the historical and theological importance of the gospel can be maintained regardless of one's view concerning its authorship. I agree with that statement, but I think he's totally missing out, because it's one thing to say, okay, this is good, it's a canonical gospel, we should read it, but we're really missing out on some beautiful truths when we just realize that this is a gospel that was written from a guy that was dead for 3 to 4 days, and then Jesus raised him from the dead. It just explains all these anomalies in the gospel, not contradictions, but just a different point of view that this 4th gospel has. So that's basically the end of the thing here. Our closing thoughts. The point is, we're not alone. There are some, even within biblical scholarship, who do recognize the legitimacy of considering Lazarus as a serious contender for this for the gospel. Again, there are others who recognize the internal evidence points to Lazarus as the author of the 4th gospel. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos. I've mostly been in the 4th gospel recently, especially focusing on Lazarus, so some future videos might come out on that. But if you have any other topics or videos you'd like to have us tackle here, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. God bless. And as always, contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. And God bless.